I'm your host, Vishwa Sadashivan from Singapore. IQ is committed to fostering deeper understanding, empathy, and involvement through meaningful, informed conversations across boundaries. We want to hear from people directly involved. Now, today, we talk about an important issue that has yet to gain prominence in our head and heart: the rights and plight of Indigenous peoples. It is partly to commemorate International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, which was on the 9th of August. The World Bank estimates that there are between 370 and 500 million Indigenous peoples in more than 90 countries around the world. They are among the most marginalized people in economic, social, and cultural terms. They make up just 5% of the global population, but they account for 15%, of the extreme poor. Their life expectancy is about 20 years lower than that of the general population worldwide. 70% of Indigenous peoples live in Asia. Indigenous peoples around the world have been facing harsh realities from all quarters and for centuries, often in the name of modernization, development, and progress. They faced eviction from ancestral lands and forced relocations. They've been denied the opportunity to express their culture, their tradition and customs. They have their children forcibly taken away from them, subjected to forced religious conversion. They've been forced into sterilization, enslavement, destruction of food sources, exposure to substance abuse, unjust incarceration in the name of the law, and even the introduction of deadly diseases and genocidal violence. Perhaps the most diabolical case of systematic extermination of Indigenous peoples, or the original peoples of the land, was in Central and North America. It's been dubbed by some prominent historians as, I quote, Indigenous Holocaust. There's been several estimates by experts on how many Native Americans lost their lives from 1492, when Christopher Columbus arrived, to the year 1900. There appears to be some consensus around the figure of 70 to 100 million. I'm talking about 70 to 100 million people dead. Here's a description by an expert. Disease and genocide were interdependent forces acting dynamically that led to the deaths. Genocide also refers to cultural genocide, a devastation of the Indigenous people's unique way of life, their identity. In the last 100 years or so, there appears to be some recognition of these issues. There have been stronger lobbies in societies and actions taken by governments, yet the needle does not seem to have moved. Well, not really. Take Canada, for example. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau received strong support from Indigenous peoples in the 2015 elections, and more recently appointed the first Indigenous Governor General of Canada. Yet, existing legislation continues to result in structural oppression of Indigenous peoples. Canada, together with Australia, New Zealand, and the USA, voted against the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. Aboriginal law is still based on the 145-year-old Indian Act. In Africa, there's hardly any recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples. Generally, all black Africans are considered indigenous. This ignores the fact that during colonial rule, agricultural peoples had more access to education and healthcare compared to the hunter-gatherer pygmies of Central Africa or the nomadic pastoralists like the Maasai and the Samburu in East Africa. Even in countries where the rights of Indigenous peoples have formal status, the question remains whether enough has been done in reality. Malaysia's Orang Asal, which means original people, have a special position enshrined in the federal constitution. Yet, they still face forced religious conversion, displacement from their traditional forests, and lack of basic amenities like potable water. Only 6% of Orang Asal children complete secondary education. The Human Rights Commission of Malaysia in 2013 submitted a report with 18 recommendations to resolve the issue of land rights of the Orang Asal. It has yet to be debated in Parliament. Instead, some of the land rights defenders have been verbally threatened or even physically attacked. In Thailand, a master plan to address deforestation allows the suppression and arrest of people who invade forests, but this does not distinguish between illegal intruders and indigenous communities that have lived in those areas for a long time. Ongoing human rights violations include forced evictions from traditional lands, burning of the houses, arrests and prosecutions, and even the murder and disappearance of human rights defenders. Now let's move to Australia. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have faced systematic marginalization since the British arrived over 230 years ago in 1788. This resulted in the desecration of Aboriginal sacred sites and property, and the killing of a large number of Aboriginal people. Especially since the late 1990s, there have been growing calls for the government to apologize to the Aboriginal people. In February of 2008, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued a formal apology for the past mistreatment of Aboriginal peoples. Parliament acknowledged the practice of forcibly removing Indigenous children from their families. A Close the Gap campaign was launched in 2008 to close the gap in life expectancy, educational achievement, and employment opportunities. Yet, the long-running housing crisis faced by the Aboriginal people has been exacerbated. The National Agreement on Closing the Gap has set ambitious targets to reduce the number of Indigenous children in care by 45%, to reduce it by 45%. However, it also does not sufficiently address issues like drugs and alcohol, mental health, and the increasing rates of Indigenous incarceration. What is encouraging is that, especially in the last 20 years, the rights of Indigenous peoples have been increasingly recognized globally through various United Nations-led instruments. Perhaps the most significant initiative is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or Undrip, in 2007. It grants Indigenous peoples the right to self-determination, to maintain their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, and to enjoy all the rights contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But, as with other UN declarations, it is not legally binding, but sets international standards on the treatment of Indigenous peoples. Well, there are three big questions, therefore. Number one, have these initiatives translated to real change on the ground? Number two, what are the challenges faced by governments that's making them less willing to make these changes happen? Number three, what would motivate societies to be more inclusive of Aboriginal peoples?